traditionally, our job as journalists is to cover conflicts. But increasingly, over the last couple of years, we see that some journalists are also finding themselves targeted by hate themselves. Those insults have skyrocketed, fueled by the rise of social media and encrypted messaging services. And the reality today is that a wildfire of hate is raging against some journalists online, particularly those who cover controversial topics. Let's take a look.
Disruptive developments, calling for radical innovations. Digitization has sparked dynamic shifts that are changing our everyday lives. Do you want to understand how and why? Let's get to it.
When the media becomes afraid of hate, how do professionals cope with a constant threat? Hate speech.
So that is the question. And in the next 35 minutes, we're going to ask, how do journalists deal with such hate? How does it influence their reporting? And also, what can be done to counter it? And I'm very glad to welcome 3 panelists with me today who will share their insights and personal experiences as well. With us is Vladimir Garay, who is a journalist and the Advocacy and Communications Director at nonprofit Derechos Digitales. Hello. Joining us from Vilnius is Belarusian human rights activist Natalia Satsunkevich, who works for the Human Rights Center Vyazna.
Hello.
And last but not least, with me here in the studio, and I'm glad to have you here right by my side, is Maria Makeeva, who's the editor-in-chief of Russian language TV channel OstWest TV, which is based in Berlin.
Exactly, thank you.
Maria, if I may start by asking you this. You've been leading your newsroom since 2017, so it's been 4 years.
Yeah.
In those 4 years, have you noticed an increase in hate or insults directed towards you or also the other journalists working in your newsroom?
Absolutely, yeah. And I connected it mostly and on the first place with the social media development, actually. Social media gave us a lot of opportunities, we know it. But also they gave us a lot of bad sides of our profession because they destroyed the distance between audience and you. It's good on one side and it's bad also. Because when you receive hatred, you receive it a lot, like a lot, yeah. And especially when you work on television. So we cope with this all the time. And yes, but we should divide it, this problem when like real people, real audience write to you because they, people, they scramble, they do not understand how to react. They feel the strong reaction and it's love and sometimes it's hatred, but you create something which gives some strong emotions and reaction to people. And another problem is when some special people, special audience, and not real audience come to you, approach you, and you feel so much hatred you could imagine. And I think that Belarusian colleagues probably will tell a lot about this as well, because we connected it to some special news about Alexei Navalny, Russian politicians who is in jail now, or any Belarusian news, any. When you started to talk about it, you receive something, some reaction, and it's not real audience for sure, yeah.
And we want to talk about this later on in our discussion, who might be behind this hate and if there are certain mechanisms. But I actually want to direct my question that I directed to you first, also to Vladimir. Vladimir, you heard it. Maria said she has noticed, both personally and in her newsroom, an increase in hate over the last couple of years. What would you say in Latin America? Have you noticed any of that?
Yes, of course. I think the latest wave of authoritarianism has increased the attacks on journalists. And one of the things that we've seen in the last couple of years is that politicians and public authorities endorsing attacks on journalists, or sometimes tacitly endorsing. And we saw this in Brazil, we've seen this in Venezuela, most recently in El Salvador, but we also saw it in the United States under Trump. So basically, this is something that is happening all around the world, and it's very concerning because, as Maria said, this transform the way that journalists need to do their jobs, and most journalists not necessarily know how to deal with these sort of attacks. So I think it's a very, very important that journalists around the world understand the nature of this type of conducts and what can they do about it. That's, I think, is really, really important.
And this is exactly what we want to talk about today. But before we get to that, I want to bring in Natalia Satsunkevich, who is talking to us from Vilnius, but who is Belarusian. Natalia, help us understand the situation of journalists in Belarus a little better. It's, of course, a special situation. We know that there are repressions against independent journalists by the regime. Can you give us your first-hand account as a human rights activist? What do you hear from journalists that you're in touch with? How is the situation for them right now?
Yeah, sure. It's really very important when we speak about situation about human rights in Belarus. When we rely a lot on information from independent media. And I even can't tell how important is the information that they gather. You can check, for example, this information from the protest in August and later and before. And also we can judge, we see how government authorities, how they repress journalists. So like it really shows that they do good work and they spread real information, and so authorities try to silence them. And like the work of independent media was always difficult in Belarus, and these repressions for journalists, they are not new. For today, 27 journalists are in prison for different cases. And also, I checked that in 2020, there were 450 cases of repressions for journalists in Belarus in different forms. They are fines, detentions, short-term arrests, and so on. And really, the job of journalists in Belarus is very important, extremely important now, and also it's very difficult.
Maria, now you are reporting from Berlin for a Russian language audience. You said previously that you did notice that hate and insults have been on the rise in those last couple of years. How does that affect your work and the work of your newsroom?
You know, this is a kind of psychological job also to work with the people in general and people in the newsroom, especially in such a situation. Of course, comparing to what to Belarusian colleagues happen, like we're not in jail, at least. Yeah, we're free to go and free to speak whatever we want. So when you will measure this stress, as I can call it, yeah, it will be, of course, less. And yeah, I understand and realize. But you anyway have to deal with it and have to calm down even people when they're really in stress because of it.
How do you do? What do you do to help
yeah,
them?
this is interesting.
Let's say I'm a young reporter in your newsroom.
Yeah, so I did receive some like hatred messages, yeah, and some comments even. Yeah, how do you deal with it? Tell us, because it's like everyday life if you work on television. You tell yourself and tell to your colleague, which is true, that you helped very strong emotion to be born. The worst thing when people have no emotions at all when you read something you wrote or you present, yeah? This is the worst thing can happen to you. If you create some news which really make difference, you will create hatred, unfortunately, as well. People sometimes can't cope with it. I mean, audience, yeah? And when you realize it, that in that case, in some cases, yeah, hatred means the same like love. It's easier to cope with this. Yeah, but it's an ordinary situation when you have really normal talk, like normal. It's not very normal, but you have to understand that that's in 2021, it's pretty much normal. Yeah, but when you have to deal with some campaigns, when many anonymity messages came, some comments, and some quite awful comments. Svetlana Tikhanovskaya just spoke about it. Like, when they call you and your colleagues' names. And this is really, you are like a boxer on some ring, and you're in defense, but sometimes this hook gets you.
That would be my question, because you said
Yeah.
it's part of your new normality, if you will, that
Yeah,
hate. And
absolutely.
has it changed you?
Yeah, somehow. You have to remind yourself and to your colleagues every day why you're doing this. Why? Because it's underpaid job. You will never get rich by this. If you're a businessman or politician, you could be president one day or rich one day. If you're a journalist, you will be pretty much the same. Yeah? And why do you do this? Why do you receive all these punches? If you know the answer for this question, you will be a good presenter as well. And you can cope with this. But this is hard. But better than prison, anyway, yeah.
Vladimir, you've heard Maria. Are those questions that you're asking yourself as well in your day-to-day work?
Well, not personally, because actually this is not something that's happened to me before. But I think that it's very important to understand that we need to abort this issue from a holistic approach. I think this is very, very important. Journalists need to be better, for example, at DGSEC. The newsroom needs to be better at DGSEC, but also we need to have access to tools, for example, to cope with this on a psychological level, for example. We need that the newsrooms has implemented protocols to avoid this type of situation and to deal with this after they happen. And also we need to understand what are the legal aspects to some sort of attacks. And we need to do this. We need to do all of these things at the same time. So as Maria was saying, like this is some sort of new normal, which is sad, of course. But at the same time, I don't think this is going to change. So we need to change somehow.
This is not going to change. We need to change. That is already a sentence I will remember from this panel today. Natalia, the repressions that journalists now experience, independent journalists experience in Belarus at the moment, what impact does that have on their work?
Unfortunately, it's a kind of chilling effect, of course, because the main aim of these repressions from authorities, it was to silence journalists and to stop the spreading of information in Belarus and outside of the country. And we see that, of course, when 27 journalists are in prison, and we have a case of 2 journalists who received 2 years in prison because of doing online stream from peaceful protest. And it was for them a kind of named as they participated in mass riots. So, of course, journalists try to understand what to do, how to continue their work, and some of them they move out from Belarus and they stop their work firstly on ground, and then also they try to understand what to do, because it's a very difficult personal question. What are you going to do, and what are your personal risks? And we can't judge anyone about this choice. And also we see that some media, they can't, for example, print hard copies now. And also some media, for example, this very famous online media to buy, their registration was cancelled, so they are not like media officially now, and so the legal regulation for them is harder. And also I wanted to tell about this influence of hate from authorities and propaganda. We see now how authorities using pro-governmental SME, TV, internet also, how they really start this wave of hate for independent media, independent journalists. And the problem is that you can't stop it. and you can't apply for police, for example, or to find any kind of legal method to stop it against you.
Maria, you brought it up earlier today that you're also thinking about who's behind those attacks. Are you trying to figure that out? Are you trying to get to the bottom of that? And where do you stand there? Like, who are these people?
That was such investigations. I mean, journalists, researchers, who are behind these people? And yeah, the answer was quite clear that there is, in Russia, there is a state department, but like department of some hidden department of the state, which just concentrated on this work, how to do with what to do with social media, how to react on events, and then. So yeah, the answer is quite clear. And also, I mean, if you explain in some situations on some exact topics like Navalny case, yeah, and immediately come people, you will connect it. I mean, this is easy, and you will realize, okay, this is their reaction. So, and also, while listening to our colleagues, I also remember this African actually case before the civil war, one civil war. They started to call the enemy side not humans via radio. They started to call them insects. And that worked absolutely perfectly, because if you will call by state radio, then there was also only radio station and this time no internet, insects, somehow in a couple of years, people start to believe that they deal with no humans. And so this is really a big job, and you have to have a lot of actually time to spend on it, but it will work somehow. So we have to fight with this. Exactly. Also, not just cope. Yeah.
Because then where are we headed? If that's sort of like, if that is the direction, the path we're going down to, I mean, where are we going to end up? And what are we going to do about it? I mean, that is probably the crucial question, how to counter it.
Just react human, be better. This is only answer, be better and more nice.
Vladimir, from your work in Latin America, what's sort of like your insights into who is behind most of the hate that is being spread, that is being fueled against journalists?
Well, it's a hard question. And being Latin America, a really big continent, it really depends on in which country are you in. For example, it's different in Venezuela than in Mexico. Probably in Venezuela, it has more to do with the government. And in Mexico, it's probably the narcos are the most dangerous ones. Same thing in Colombia, for example. And one of the things that we've seen in the last couple of years in places like Colombia, most recently, and Chile 2 years ago, is that law enforcement were behind some of those attacks. Basically because they didn't... In every situation, the most possible responsible people are the ones who don't want the truth out there, are the ones that want to silence journalists because they're afraid of what they're saying. So I think that from that point of view, what's most important to understand is that attacks on journalists are attacks on democracy. And that should be the starting point in order to create new solutions from the legal standpoint. And one of the main problems that we observe in Latin America is that even though there's a couple of countries that has special protection for journalists, like Mexico and Colombia and Honduras, which are some of the most dangerous countries for journalists, most of the time, these types of attacks are overlooked by law enforcement agencies as something that is less real for some reason. And this is not just with journalists, but with all type of violence against vulnerable groups. So one of the things that I think is very important is to create this awareness about how dangerous actually is violence on the internet, and how it's part of a larger panorama where different groups, including journalists, are being constantly attacked. And we need to do something about that.
Natalia, you described to us the situation that journalists in Belarus are operating under, and you described how difficult it is, and some decide to leave the country. What is it if someone wants to sort of support those independent journalists in doing their work, even from abroad? How can you do that?
That's a very good question. Firstly, of course, almost all journalists who are now in prison, they are considered as political prisoners. So we ask to support them in different forms. You can find this information in internet, and also there is, as I remember, a fund of solidarity for journalists and media. You also can support them. If you speak about political prisoners, it's very important to send them letters and postcards. You also can find on the website of Human Rights Center that's now their actual addresses and how to write them. And also to spread this information. You should be now the voices of these imprisoned journalists, and to tell in your country, to share with your friends, with your family, try to push your politicians to support the Belarusian people in your country, because now there are a lot of people abroad, and also those who live for many years. They started to be active. You can see actions of support and protest against the regime. So you can join them and tell that you also support their activities on this way to democracy. And that's really a great idea.
Maria, do you remember how old you were when you decided that you wanted to become a journalist?
12, yeah.
12?
I think. That was long ago. Yeah.
Why? Why did you want to become a journalist?
Oh, because I was good at school, and I could be whatever I want to be. And I decided that
and then why journalist? Not the money, you
I
said.
explain. Hi, money wasn't the question at that time. Yeah, and I understand that only in journalism I can be anyone I want every different day. This day I write about doctors, so I will be like a doctor. Next day, like politicians, and go so on. So, and at 12 when I was 12 years old, I think that this is the answer. I will be everyone.
And knowing what you know now about the reality of the life of a journalist, I'm not sort of talking about the day-to-day business at the newsroom, but the hate that you're encountering. Would you tell your own 12-year-old self, do it? Become a journalist?
Of course, for sure, yeah. But you will receive the whole package. Not part of it, not just love. You will receive everything. And yeah, you have to face it. If you don't have strength enough, never do this. But you never know. When you start to do this, you never know, will you have strength enough or not? Yeah, but anyway, also talking about journalism, there is such a burden on journalists today. So many heavy things we have to do, I mean, besides our job. Because Armin Laschet told us today that something about lösungsorientiert journalism, yeah? Really? I thought it's politicians' job.
Solution-oriented journalism.
Come on, it's not you and me who have to deal with it. But nowadays we have to. And also political activists. Do you see this line between political activism and journalism? I don't see it anymore.
Do you define it for yourself?
It's not for myself.
No, but would you clearly define a line where you're saying, like, I'm not a political activist?
I'd like to, but the life itself changed everything. Who is Protasevich, for example? Is he a politician? Yeah, and he is the main opponent of Lukashenko. He was. That's why Alexander Lukashenko grounded his plane. That's why. But is he a journalist? Yeah. Where is the line? I don't know. It depends on the country you live to. If you have the luxury to be just a journalism, just be above all it, They have to be everyone. I mean, and this is really hard.
Yeah. Vladimir, let's ask you. Is that sort of a privilege of people like Maria and me who are living in countries where there is, a freedom of expression, to decide that, because I could clearly say for myself that I am not a political activist, I'm a journalist, I clearly draw that line. But is that sort of a privilege that I have because I live in a country where that's possible?
Yes, of course. And as I say, Latin America is one of the most dangerous regions to journalists. And when you have countries like Colombia and Mexico, where journalists are killed just by doing their jobs, you have to have a different respect for what they're doing. And I totally agree with Maria. There's sometimes the line between this is just a job and this is something else. This is basically me being able to fight for what I believe, for my country, for the truth, is something that you just cannot avoid. I mean, Mexican journalists are under greater pressure. And actually, I'm in Chile, where even though, and as has become more clearly recently, we're far from this image of a growing democracy than we thought it was. It's still easier for me being based here than if I was in El Salvador, for example, that right now is under a very difficult political situation. So yeah, I think that's totally the case. It's really different to be a journalist in countries where are less freedom of expression and where it's actually dangerous to be a journalist.
And Vladimir, would you still become one? I don't know. I didn't ask you the question that I asked Maria, like how old you were when you decided to become one. But would you still, would you tell your young self? Too young?
Yeah. There's a lot that you don't know when you take these sort of decisions. And it's a very difficult question. I don't know, actually. But as Maria said, I will say it all. This is what you're going to have to deal with if you chose to keep this path. There's great things about it, too, but it's a difficult life, actually.
Natalia, you yourself are not a journalist, but what would you tell journalists? What's sort of your message to journalists as a human rights activist?
Actually, I have some colleagues who are, I call them human rights journalists because they work mostly with topics connected with human rights. And also we see that now in Belarus, a lot of independent journalists, they focus a lot on human rights because they understand the value of this topic. And also they always apply to, for example, our organization, for any comments, ideas, and also they also help us to spread information. So really many thanks to them for their work. And also we receive a lot of information from journalists about repressions, and it helps us to collect information about human rights violations and to do, for example, we produce monthly reports, thematic reports, annuals, and so on. And I really wish journalists to be brave, and I really want to remember this work that they did in these days in August, when we firstly knew about torture in Belarus. And independent media, they were the only source of information. And we have to remember that the internet was blocked for 3 days after elections in Belarus. And also journalists tried to deal with that. And it was a great challenge for them.
We already reached the end of our panel. I mean, one thing that I'm definitely taking away from this is, as you said, Vladimir, it really depends where in the world you are. And, hate isn't hate. And, it needs sort of solutions that are tailored for the respective region that you're in. But I think another thing that we also heard today very clearly is that, the goal behind online hate against journalists seems to be keeping them from digging deeper, from holding those in power accountable, from uncovering things that should not be uncovered. So in a word, to silence them. And that's dangerous because to modify the Washington Post's beautiful slogan, democracy dies in silence. So all that's left for me to say is thank you to the panelists here in the studio and remotely.